Good morning to all. My name is Cesar Iliano and I am the Content Director for Bain Americas. I'd like to welcome everybody to this webinar in which we will discuss the results of Bain Americas 2020 Infrastructure Survey. We hope that you are all in good health and taking care. We know these are difficult times for everybody. We would also like to extend a big thank you to all of those who took the time to participate in the survey. Bain Americas Managing Editor, Sebastián Pérez Ferreiro, will begin this webinar with a presentation of the highlights of our survey, which shows infrastructure spending is said to be key in the region's recovery. We will then hold a discussion with Felipe Esquerra, Investment Management Principal Officer for the Transport Division at IDB Invest, and Antonio Silveira, VP for Infrastructure at Development Bank CAF. I'd like to remind all participants that they are in listen-only mode. Questions can be submitted at any time using the chat function on the right side of the screen. So I'll leave you now with Sebastián and the highlights of the survey.
Good morning, everybody. This is the third of 4 webinars we are doing this month to show what the industries covered by BN Americas are expecting for the end of 2020 and beyond. Last week, we saw in the electric power survey that a majority of respondents believe the worst impact from the COVID-19 pandemic is over. In the infrastructure sector survey, in which 50% of surveyed professionals were C-level or senior management executives, we see significant harm caused by COVID, but there are high hopes that governments will support the sector. Almost 50% of respondents work for construction and engineering companies, followed by government agencies and consultancies. In our first graph, we see the perception of the harm produced by the coronavirus. Thousands of projects came to a halt in March as the governments reacted to the first signs of the pandemic. Nearly 60% of all respondents said the impact to their activities was big. Almost 30% said it was moderate. The health crisis also affected the execution of works, hitting the planning and engineering and construction companies that are developing projects. The stoppage of projects and approval processes of government agencies are the factors cited as driving the biggest impact on operations. As an executive from an engineering and construction company with operations in several countries in the region told us, priorities have changed. Some projects have been canceled and others are on standby, while conferences and networking meetings are impossible due to travel restrictions. When asked how big an impact COVID-related health protocols will have on operations such as projects and costs going forward, almost 51% of respondents said the impact will be moderate. Part of the reason for this could be public infrastructure budgets. Around 44% believe that public budgets will increase, 36% expect them to remain flat, and only 25% expect infra budgets to shrink. Most of those surveyed expect Argentina, Venezuela, and Mexico to be the countries where public investment in infrastructure decreases the most. Brazil falls in the middle. 10% of those surveyed believe the country will have one of the biggest reductions in public spending on infrastructure in the region, while 14% think it is well prepared to continue investing in public funds and infra projects. A respondent from a Brazilian government agency told us the liabilities derived from the cost of the pandemic will have to be paid over the next few years, which will reduce the availability of funds to finance these types of projects. In this scenario, how is the approval or design of new projects after the pandemic perceived? There is a certain optimistic bias in the responses. Almost 50% believe that the number will increase. Around 21% expect it to fall, while 17% think that there will be no major change. The most optimistic respondents have operations or a presence in Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Brazil. Despite the significant progress made in recent decades, Latin America continues to have a huge infrastructure deficit. The IDB estimates that this gap is equivalent to around 2.5% of regional GDP, or around $150 billion. The gap is most prominent in transport infrastructure, despite large projects developed in recent years. Multilateral credit institutions will play a critical part in the sector, according to the survey. They're seen as the best financing option for the infrastructure projects, especially in the near term, as governments promote infrastructure development. A financial consultant with operations in Colombia, Mexico, and Peru told us the countries will have to find mechanisms to mobilize local capital, such as pension funds, and the role of development financial institutions will be important, facilitating mechanisms such as guarantees. Remember that we will be having a conversation later on in this webinar with two key executives from the IDB Invest and CAF, who will talk about the role of their multilaterals during the crisis and beyond. In the next slide, here's where we ask for the best financing options for infrastructure projects. In line with what we saw in the previous chart, multilateral institutions come out on top. The second option are international bonds, and the third is financing by pension funds. Pension funds have been in the news lately, with some countries allowing people to withdraw parts of their pensions during the pandemic-driven economic crisis, a trend that could accelerate across the region. On the opportunity side, projects related to water, such as water treatment plants, management and storage systems, and desalination stand out the most. This reflects both the growing supply problems faced by large cities, including Mexico City and Sao Paulo, as a result of droughts, desertification, and other effects of climate change. More than half of the companies that identify water projects as presenting the best opportunities have operations in Chile, which is accustomed to long spells of dry weather and extreme droughts. The BN Americas project database has 33 desalination plants in early stages or under construction, most of them in Chile. The need to increase infrastructure investments contrasts with lower government revenues, which means the participation of the private sector will be key. Participants in the BN Americas survey are very clear about it. An overwhelming 86% believe that public-private partnerships will play a more relevant role in the development of these types of projects after the pandemic. We're seeing the governments in Peru, Paraguay, Brazil, Panama, and Chile pushing ahead with their PPP programs even during the pandemic. But many are asking themselves if the traffic and use forecasts for these types of assets will still hold, as demand has collapsed. And it is not clear yet what traffic volume airports and other infrastructure can expect to see in the future. PPPs will continue to play a role in the future, according to the survey. 80% of those surveyed believe that the PPP model will thrive despite the problems faced during the pandemic. A respondent from a Chilean government agency suggests that future PPP contracts should consider major disruptions such as pandemics, and that governments will need to be more flexible in future concessions. When it comes to identifying the most promising markets, Chile once again tops the list, both for the opportunities it offers and for having the best business environment, according to a majority of respondents. The political and economic stability and its long-standing commitment to the PPP model to develop infrastructure projects makes up for the relatively small size of its market. Chile is growing and needs better connectivity, says an engineering company with operations in Chile, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru. Finally, what are the risks the industry is now facing? And there's one that rises above the rest and is a constant risk in many Latin American countries: a chronic weak financial position. Battered state economies are emerging as the greatest threat to the post-pandemic recovery. A third of those surveyed indicate that the weak fiscal situation in which the governments of the regions will find themselves is the main threat to bringing the infrastructure sector back to normal. Governments have incurred in high costs to stimulate the economy and subsidize parts of the population to fend off the worst effects of the pandemic, which has paralyzed entire sectors during the peak of infections and wreaked havoc on tax revenue. The second biggest threat mentioned by respondents is linked to the first, and it's low GDP growth. The third biggest perceived threat is a second wave of the pandemic. These were the main highlights of our survey. I hope our expert panelists can now add insights from the two most important development banks in the region. Cesar.
Thanks, Sebastian. As we announced before, we will now hold a discussion with Felipe Esquerra, Investment Management Principal Officer for the Transport Division at IDB Invest, and Antonio Silveira, VP for Infrastructure at Development Bank CAF. I remind you that audience members can write their questions on the chat window at the right side of the screen, and we will try to get to the audience questions. So, good morning, Antonio and Felipe. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. How are you? Good morning, everybody.
Good morning, everybody.
Thank you. I'd like to start the conversation pointing out to one of the questions in the survey. We saw that half of respondents say they expect a moderate impact into their operations from the pandemic going forward, and 44% expect public infra budgets to increase after the pandemic. Is this an optimistic sign? Is that a sign that the worst of the crisis is already behind? I know, Felipe.
I don't know, Antonio.
Yeah.
Do you begin?
Okay, no problem. Well, I think yes, the worst of the pandemics is in the past, but there are still a lot of risks and questions, and we have a very, I think, hard period from now on because of all the uncertainties that come up. One thing, I think part of the countries on the region, Latin American, Caribbean region, have some fiscal flexibility and can deal a little bit better on the fiscal side, like Chile, Peru, among others. But most of the countries are with a lot of restrictions here. Of course, there will be an effort to reactivate the economies, dealing especially with infrastructure initiatives. One important issue here that's already been discussed on G20, OECD, all around, is that, let us say, the schedule of these efforts. Like placing a bet on new projects right now, it's going to be a little bit difficult, not only because of all of the uncertainties, but because it takes time to build up good projects, to have the licenses, everything else. So first stage for this initiative, using investment in infrastructure to reactivate the economies, I think has to begin with public works in a very simple sense, like road maintenance, things like that, in order to replace the income support that most of the countries are assigning to the families, and try to phase in some leverage on recuperating employment. I think this is one first movement that can be succeeded by another initiatives, then with more comprehensive pipeline of projects, including PPPs, once we have a little bit of clarity about the risks that I mentioned earlier. So I think the path is going to be just like this. And what I'm hearing all around with governments is more or less in this way. Thanks. Felipe, may you step in?
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Antonio, in the sense that I agree that probably the worst has passed, but it's difficult to anticipate really, I don't know, the rhythm in which the investments will recover. But just to add in a more general comment regarding the public and investment and the capacity of the countries to really deploy big amounts of money for infra, is that just to comment that really this reduction in public money for infra is not just a consequence of the COVID it was a trend before in which countries needed to find ways to develop more projects, and most of the countries had, before the COVID, fiscal restrictions. Probably now they have more. And then just that comment, that trend to change the public investment for private ways to attract investment for infra was a trend that, in my opinion, will continue in the future. And there the problem is as Antonio also said, how the countries are able to develop a really feasible pipeline of projects, and that, for me, I would say that is the main concern, to try to define how that pipeline and that necessities for new infrastructure projects in the region will really be deployed in the coming months and years.
Yeah, there's something that Antonio said that we are seeing here in Chile and some other countries. If there's a moment to try to streamline bureaucracy and try to make anything from the governments to make all the permitting processes and all the paperwork go faster, it's now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That is one of the aspects that could be, I don't know, of course, be improved by the countries in the sense to try to accelerate the process of that project, specifically if we think in PPPs and concessions and different ways to attract more private investment.
Yeah, anyway, this has to be done with all the legal support needed on these cases. We cannot forget that social environmental responsibility is already streamlined, both on the culture and on legislation. And of course, if you want to simplify the things that is somehow needed, you need to address the specifics, even in legal terms, about this, because without it, you can have some kind of judiciary uncertainty on the future. So it's really very important to address very carefully these issues.
Okay, yeah, and in line with what we are talking about, the survey also showed that 48% of respondents believe that there will be an increase in the approval and design of new infra projects, something that doesn't look that you are completely agreeing on, but we are seeing everyday governments announcing programs and works to try to quickly reactivate economies. But the question here is, what are the subsectors and countries that you see that may really get the will to start moving faster in Latin America in infra projects?
Well, Antonio, if you let me,
Your turn,
I can start with this. Well, first, in general, I agree with the 48% of the respondents that says that they expect more approvals and designs of projects after the pandemic and in the coming years. I agree absolutely with that. As we said before, for me, I would say that the main concern, as I said, continue being, I don't know, the capacity of the countries to structure a strong pipeline of projects, specifically if we think in PPPs. In that sense, just to comment with the audience, supporting countries in strengthening the regulatory frameworks and developing and structuring specifically PPP projects is one of the strategic objectives of the IDB group, not just IDB Invest, but also the IDB group as a whole that created around 3 years ago a central PPP unit that specifically try to support the countries in that aspect. Having said that, of course, we see some countries that have developed and are developing a strong pipeline. I would say, of course, Chile, Brazil, and Colombia very clearly, but also Peru, and also some interesting projects coming to the market. For example, in Mexico, in coming weeks, like for example the tender for Mexico DF Metro Line 1, and in that sense we see some countries very prepared to try to develop this pipeline of projects. And regarding some specific subsector, I don't want to anticipate a lot in some other aspects that of course we will talk in the coming minutes, but specifically I would like to mention the water and sanitation sector, and specifically one country that is Brazil, where we expect very good opportunities after the approval in Congress in last June of the new regulatory framework for the sector, that we expect that could create opportunities for more than $15 billion of investments in the coming years, and then that we see like a very really good opportunity for investments.
Great.
Fully agree with you, Felipe. I think really PPPs are already established way to provide infrastructure initiatives in the region. The region already has a track record, especially the countries that you mentioned, but there are some latecomers that are coming in with very interesting ideas. They may not be projects actually, but very good ideas, including in legal terms. CAF has a very nice initiative on our diplomado in APPs offered for all the region for the public officials, and it's been a huge success. We are already on the second round of this diplomado, and we fully support the initiatives around the region. Fully agree that water and sanitation in Brazil is a novelty after the approval of this regulatory framework approved by the Congress right now. I think Chile, with the issues of water, will be a interesting market for this too, not only in desalinization projects, but in other initiatives. Panama is dealing with some initiatives here in water terms too that are very interesting. What I see is, yes, we have a pipeline of projects, interesting pipeline of projects, potential new initiatives, but just one reminder here for, let us say, secure the path for PPPs in the region. And I'm here talking about the ongoing contracts and the impacts of the pandemics on this contract, how to deal with it. Let us say, standard fact of our countries is that there's a lot of political debate over concessions, PPPs, etc. And this somehow goes to justice too. After Odebrecht, etc., kind of turmoil came in, and the pandemics impacted very differently, but impacted almost all the concessions and PPP contracts all around. Governments were able to build up provisional actions to maintain some financial feasibility of these contracts, but I see that in the future they will need to be addressed in terms of restoring the equilibrium, and some of them even restructuring. This will be very important. It has to be done very cautiously. to keep PPPs as a positive option for infrastructure in the region, and I call attention for that. Thanks.
Yeah, and that's something I'd like to understand. Maybe you can give me some insights on this answer from the survey, because of course you're saying that PPP is the way to go going forward, but it looks like the respondents of the survey are okay with PPPs, but when there's multilateral money involved, 46.4% said that the best option to finance infrastructure project was loans from multilateral institutions. And they also say that 67% say that multilaterals will be now fundamental in catalyzing financial resources for projects. So it looks like they want you to be there, right, Antonio?
Yes, but let me quote Professor Ottaviano Canuto, former VP for PREM at the World Bank, among others, a lot of things that he has done in Washington, D.C. Last week, he published on America's Quarterly an article that is called "Don't Expect Miracles from the Multilaterals." And this, we have to put it straightforward. Of course, multilaterals have a role, but they don't have illimited balance sheets. So we have to deal with a business model that is common to all multilaterals, as keeping a good rating to borrow cheap and lend somehow cheap. IDB is cheaper than us, CAF, but we try somehow to manage jointly a lot of stuff. In this business model, I would like to go to ex-CFO of the World Bank. One other aspect of this business model is that there is no regulator for these multilaterals. So we are completely in the hands of rating agencies. This complicates a little bit because you have to deal with the issue of ratings, going to the market and maintain your business model in a very strict sense. So we can, in spite of the huge effort that CAF, IDB, World Bank, etc., have done on the last 6 months, at least, on this effort for the pandemics. Of course, there are limits on lending, and by the same token, lending to private sector, it's usually riskier than sovereign lending. The mix that we can handle differs from institution to institution, but we have to handle that mix. IDB has two separate bodies. IDB Invest, dealing with private sector. IDB, dealing with sovereign operations. CAF has all bundled in one single balance sheet. So it's different of management of these balance sheets. And I think on the limits of our balance sheets, this specific role that we have to enhance is the role of catalyzing resources, not only from co-lending with other multilaterals, but address especially the huge fixed income pool of money that is all around in this effort to help infrastructure to be a world-class asset. This is an agenda that was put forward in 2008, 2009, and still a lot of distance to travel to arrive at a situation where we have a kind of open market for investment in infrastructure projects. A lot of stuff have been done, but there's a lot to be done too. And this role of catalyzing, I think, is the most promising that the multilaterals can give to the countries. A part of all the support on structuring and knowledge, capacity building, etc. I think this is the main way that we can contribute for all the countries in the region on this effort for infrastructure. Felipe,
do you see the same way?
Yeah. Just to well, one more time, Antonio, fully agree with your comments and views. Just to complement with some comment, of course, it's true that in situations like this, it's normal that now everybody and the market in general turns their head to the multilaterals, and that is true, and it's good, because really this is our strategy in good and in bad times. Our work is to try to support the countries in the region, and we do not have any other strategy. Then I would say we cannot go to do business in other places, and then we are here, and we will continue being here. And in that sense, I'm sure CAF, but of course IDB and IDB Invest, we have very clear our the necessity that we need to play a counter-cyclical role, and that is very clear for us, and we understand how the market is expecting from us. And then fully agree with the comments of Antonio regarding that at the end, of course, we as multilaterals, we have our own limits, and that is also a reality. And just to make a last comment is that I think, and I agree, of course, on the key role that we need to play in trying to mobilize and to catalyze third-party investments for infrastructure in the region. And we are working on that in different ways, but I agree that is one of the key aspects for the future, and how we as institutions are able to create new ways and different ways to catalyze that investments. Just to put an example of CAF, not just of IDB, I think, for example, the creation of CAFAM, the fund of that is managed by CAF, for example, in Uruguay, has been an example of different ways to catalyze third-party investments, to invest in infrastructure, and how that type of structure can benefit of, I don't know, all the knowledge, the capacity building, as Antonio said, and very specifically the capacity of manage environmental and social risks in the project to create new structure to attract capital for infra, and I'm sure that CAF is now in new initiatives of that type. We in IDB Invest and in IDB are working in some initiatives in that sense, and continue creating new structures is one of the key aspects for the future.
Thanks. Yeah. I have one other question before we jump into the audience questions. Is you mentioned sanitation projects in Brazil, in Panama, but what the survey is saying is that the respondents are seeing the best opportunities, investment opportunities in all kind of water projects, potable water plants, water transport, desalination plants. Is this what you see in your pipeline of projects?
Yeah, as I said before, we see a robust pipeline of projects in the water and sanitation sector. I mentioned before the situation of Brazil, but also several projects and in Chile, but also some very interesting and big projects in Colombia and Peru, and we think that this continue being a trend for the coming years. It's true that some of these projects are yet in a preparation stage, but we, at least as IDB Invest, we are prepared to support these projects. In that sense, just to comment that we in IDB Invest defined 4 years ago water and sanitation as one of the 4 sectors to put the focus in the infrastructure and energy division in IDB Invest, together with energy, transportation, and social infra. And that was new for the bank because previously all the support to this sector had been canalized through the IDB with sovereign guarantee loans, and then we began to work specifically in IDB Invest to try to support projects for the private sector in this specific sector, and then we have been able to close some important and interesting transactions. For example, a loan to Interagua, that is the company that manages all the water distribution in Guayaquil, in Ecuador, or supporting VRK Ambiental in Brazil to support expansion of the sanitation in the metropolitan region of Recife in the northeast of Brazil. And then we see this as a trend for the region, and of course we are prepared and fully interested in supporting specifically this type of investments.
Yeah, Antonio.
Well, from our point of view, just let me explain. The infrastructure vice presidency deals mostly with projects on transportation, ICT, energy, and logistics in general. The parts dealing with social infrastructures in water and sewage is led by the Vice Presidency for Sustained Development. That's under the command of my good friend Julian Suarez. But I can say there's a lot of demand in Argentina, in Paraguay, on this sector of water and sanitation, especially. Panama is increasing too, but here we have some very hard challenges on implementation of initiatives of water apart from Panama Canal. In this presidency of infrastructure, now we have a surge of demand for projects on digitalization. I think that the boom of digital technologies during the pandemic is here to stay. It's one of the sources of a lot of uncertainty, the path of this boom, how we're going to do, or the impacts on employment, etc. But what we are seeing that several countries and several companies are targeting that, and we are doing some very nice operations, multi-sector operations, led by digitalization initiatives, but with spillovers on health, education, etc. Already on several countries like Argentina, we're talking about it in Brazil, etc. This will be a trend, and it's a trend that we have to look on for the spaces of public and private sector on it. Of course, on operation, there's a lot of private capital on that. It's mainly private driven, but on backbones and some structure initiatives, I think, yes, there's space for public sector, and we're working hard on it, both on national levels, but at local levels too on the region. And this has been very interesting.
Thank you. We have some time for some questions from the audience. The first comes is for Argentina. Is given the situation in Argentina and after the deal, how do you see the outlook for the development banks creating new lines for Argentina in the coming months?
Well, I don't know if Antonio, if you want, I can start. Well, really, we are monitoring and analyzing that, I would say, every week. And we from IDB Invest, of course, is in a specific situation because in general we finance long-term, we provide long-term project finance loans. That is, since the point of view of the different risks involved, something I don't know, more specific to analyze the risk. Of course, more than simply the sovereign risk of Argentina. But I would say that we are, as I said, we are monitoring this situation every week and analyzing that in a I don't know, in a general point of view as IDB group, and of course for us is very important first this that the situation in Argentina could improve and solve some of these key problems as a first step to I don't know, to can begin to develop new transactions, long-term transactions in Argentina.
Well, from our side, the sovereign lending to Argentina this year goes a little above 800 million. It's an important amount, but like Felipe mentioned, for private sector, we have now really a lot of risk issues and challenges, even in regulated sectors that we are keeping like a standby position.
Okay, great. There's another question, and it's about Latin America and the US. Is how do you think the US presidential election process in the months to come, if it can have a negative or positive effect in the investment flows into Latin America in the last part of the year and in the first months of next year?
Well, this is a very interesting question. The path of the foreign investment will depend a lot on the framework that the countries are able to set in for this promotion of recuperation after pandemics or in the midst of the pandemics. Of course, the institutional arrangement here is quite important, and the political stability is a central issue too. I think one of the big challenges we face ahead is to bring in some political agreement among the different parts that are on the political process to like set up a field where you can play politics without impacting hard on economics. We have already experienced on that during the super cycle of the commodities. There was somehow a general agreement among most of the countries, but I think this is a very important thing to manage. And when I speak about politics, it's not only the congressional politics. It deals with the major institutional arrangements on the countries. It's kind of equilibrium among the powers. Congressional, judiciary, executive branches have to seek a leveling play field in order to give some, reduce the uncertainty that's already soaring because of all the pandemics, the impacts of digitalization, etc. We have to counteract all this uncertainty that is coming from irreversible facts with some kind of general agreements on how to play politics and how to have the checks and balances among the powers in order to give more clarity and to move on for most of the countries. What we have to recognize is that most of the region was not in good shape before the pandemics. It was heavily affected by the pandemics. We saw capital flight from the beginning of this year on several countries. And this, we have to take a close look, think about it as citizens, as policymakers, in order to move ahead, of course, without a political debate, but bringing in some equilibrium on that. I think this is the most important issue that we have to deal right now.
Felipe?
I know, of course, one more time I agree with Antonio, but just going direct to the question, if we expect a very different, I don't know, a very different framework for the U.S. investments in Latin America in the coming months, specifically linked to the electoral process in the U.S. I would say that we do not see that. Of course, we are seeing, for example, a very clear position of I don't know, of interest in trying to support projects and countries. For example, from the U.S., for example, through the DFC, and then in that sense, we do not expect any significant change in that aspect in the future, and nor specifically linked to the electoral process in the US in the coming, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 months.
Great, thanks. We have time for one last question from the audience, and there are two of them pointing to Mexico. What's the medium-term outlook for infra projects for Mexico, and what are the projects that you see most likely coming along or being materialized? That's the last one. Antonio?
Yeah. Mexico, it's expanding the pipeline of projects, actually. There's very interesting things in urban mobility. Mexico City Metro was, the expansion is one interesting initiative. There are a lot of talking about Yucatan Peninsula, not only the Mayan Railway, but a lot of initiatives in order to integrate like a kind of corridor from Atlantic to Pacific there. And there's some specific discussion on the poorest regions of Mexico, like Tabasco, for example, that there are a lot of discussions on how to intervene based on infrastructure to promote development in these areas. So I think on a medium run, Mexico has some promising features about initiatives and infrastructure, although, like mentioned earlier, the fiscal impact of the pandemics will be huge, and this will naturally lead to a situation where some prioritization will be needed. And this is, I think, is the big question, how they will prioritize those interventions. Felipe?
No, agree, and just to comment that in my view, a key aspect to take in account is that Mexico have a huge experience in developing different type of concession, long-term concession contracts and PPP concession contracts for years, and in that sense they have a very I don't know, a strong infrastructure framework, legal framework for developing infrastructure projects through the private sector. And of course, Mexico is a country with all the capacity to structure and develop projects, and in that sense, we see in this moment I mentioned and Antonio mentioned now, for example, this project for the Mexico DF Metro Line 1, and they have all the capacity to develop this type of projects and to continue attracting investments. And in that sense, we are optimistic in the capacity of Mexico to continue developing a pipeline of projects.
Great. Antonio, Felipe, great. Thank you very much for being with us today. It was a very interesting conversation. And this concludes our presentation on the BINAmerica's 2020 Electric Infrastructure Sector Survey. We thank you for listening in. Have a great day and take care.